I'm delighted to welcome Sam, who is in the philosophy department at Manipur University, and Manipur University is in northeast India. Dr. Ngaihte has written Vedic Practice, Ritual Studies and Jaimini's Mīmāṃsāsūtras, Dharma and the Enjoined Subject, and Christianity and Empire in the South Manipur Hills. And I got to know Sam when he was in Oxford some time ago, when he was doing his thesis, and he's been really engaged with the study of religions and how we study religions and what's the best approach we can have. And particularly, he's developed a sort of dialogical understanding of religion, which is, links in with our subject field here in Phenomenology of Religion, I think. And today he's going to speak to us about a lecture called Desiring Dharma, Anthropotechnics and Ritual in the Mīmāṃsāsūtras. And Sam will tell us what the Mīmāṃsāsūtras are, I'm sure. Sam, over to you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. First, I would like to thank Gavin and the co-organizers for the opportunity to share and learn together. As an aspiring scholar, it has been a real privilege to listen to all of the presentations yesterday and all of today. Many of the insights that have been discussed have helped me revisit even my own understanding and thoughts already. And I've actually revised the title of my paper, but I have not updated it in the website. It is now called Plurality, Phenomenology and Verticality, Desiring Dharma in the Jaimini's Mīmāṃsāsūtras. And as a second point, I would also like to offer my greetings, usually Namaste Chibai from Manipur, India. And I do this not because this is one of the more typical practices expected of an Indian. There is actually a joke in our culture about the speaker who spends a majority of his time allotted in the thank you ceremonies with no real substantial time given to the agenda. But I do this more so because I wish to restate the pervasive notion of plurality, which I believe Phenomenology of Religion is also concerned about. And I'm speaking from a place where I'm more worried about electricity dying on me than actually the content of my paper. So that is, let me first try and set the context of my paper. I talk about phenomenology and the question of plurality. I'll be reading it out. One of the continuing challenges that any attempt to promote a meaningful understanding of the phenomenon that we call religion faces today is the sheer plurality and diversity of traditions that can now be included under its purview. The affirmation and validation of these pluralities and their otherness, particularly since the post-colonial era, have compounded the task that is set before the scholar of religion, because each of these religious traditions, they now demand an inquiry into the nature of the development within a particular historical environment. So to study the history of religion necessarily entail the need to study the histories of these varied religions. The adoption of phenomenology as a methodological approach for the study of religion, I think, can also be seen to be closely related, even if not exclusively, to these growing concerns about plurality, diversity, sometimes known as the sheer plenitude, the sheer dareness of others. And the task of a phenomenological investigation of religion is thereby seen as the search for the essential and unifying features of these varied religions. And a comparative analysis is often adopted or generally adopted to attempt to explicate these essences from the multiplicity of religious phenomena that we find all around us today. So the goal of comparison between religious traditions involve moving out of a particular historical context, something that is discussed already yesterday, in an effort to present a generalized trans-historical essence. So the phenomenological approach is often argued to arise in response to the limitations of the social scientific study of religions. The examinations of religious data through disciplines such as philology, archaeology, sociology, etc. are criticized for their sidelining of the essentially religious nature of the data under investigation, often in their efforts to adhere to the spirit of the sciences or scientificity. Phenomenology of religion considers itself to be distinct from this, or even distinct from not only the social sciences, but the theological approaches to the study of religion, precisely because it treats religion as a phenomenon that cannot be explained in terms of any particular aspect of human society or culture. In other words, the particular is taken to be unable to offer fundamental or trans-historical insights. As phenomenology of religion is interested in universal or essential features that are applicable to all religions, rather than to particular ones, it is seen as one of the best approaches today to inquire into religion, especially in the midst of these growing diverse manifestations. And the plethora of investigations that we have discussed, that we have read about, that have been carried out through the phenomenological approach, has since located the essence of religion in the human experience of sometimes a universal and transcendent, although indeterminate, aspect of reality. The manifestations of the sacred, such as Eliade's hierophany, or the experience of the numinous, such as Otto's transcendent mystery, are regularly taken as examples that can characterize and fundamentally define all these forms of religious expressions. The specificity of the various traditions under comparison are often bracketed or sidelined, and the variety of differences that we find are often portrayed as merely cultural rather than fundamental. And although phenomenologists of religion often seek to distance themselves from Husserlian phenomenology, the fundamental concepts such as bracketing, empathy, to some extent the eidetic reduction, all of which play an important role in the development of their comparative methods, is borrowed from Edmund Husserl. So they draw insights from Husserl's notion of epoche and empathy. And for example, Vendeleu notes that the task of the phenomenologist involves the bracketing of their beliefs about particular traditions and their truth claims, and to describe what appears or shows itself as it shows itself. So not only is phenomenology of religion able to engage plurality by introducing ahistorical essences, its mode of engagement is also seen to be valid and scientific because of this neutrality or value-free discourses. There is no bias towards any particular religious traditions, and there is no affiliation towards them in phenomenology of religion. Now, while the comparative analysis of phenomenology of religion has helped develop an approach that can take the plurality of religions into account, and taking this into account itself is already some sort of a victory for many traditions, the manner of comparison that is done and the philosophical foundation upon which this comparison is constituted is problematic, because it does not take the internal rationalities that constitutes the otherness or the alterity and historicity of these religious traditions, and also the existential nature of their traditional human aspirations seriously into account. It wants to take them into account, but it cannot take them into account because of its phenomenological approach. And so what is the problematic? There are two levels at which the limitations of phenomenology of religion is highlighted in this paper. The first one concerns the nature of comparative approach it undertakes, particularly in relation to the question of plurality. There will be critics, and there are critics who claim that the positing of the sacred, the holy, as the universal essence of religion is not a neutral claim, but a privileging of a Western and especially Christian conceptualization of religion. This idea of the holy or the sacred, as discussed by Otto or Eliade and many others, may fit certain aspects of monotheistic religions, such as Christianity, Judaism, maybe even to an extent Islam, but it will be deemed inappropriate for the study of Eastern religions, such as Jainism or Buddhism, for example. But then again, I'm very careful to claim that now, because Professor Yoshi has already pointed out that there can be some levels of comparison that are possible, even when we talk about the sacred in Eastern and Western religious traditions. But in a sense, the point is the comparative method is criticized because it is deemed to be unable to take particularities seriously. And this is a serious criticism because phenomenology sometimes sees itself as an amic methodology of the study of religion in some sense. And closely related to this is the second concern about the limitations of the ontological ground upon which this comparative analysis is based. The validity of the comparative method is dependent on its ability to present an objective, unbiased, empathetic understanding of religions. And this presupposes a transcendental subjectivity as the ground of neutrality and certitude. This objective insight that is gathered by the transcendental subjectivity, whose metaphysical assumption is often grounded in the consciousness-driven perspective of the Enlightenment, and which often claims an epistemological privilege because of the nature of how it defines reason, entails the suspension of the natural attitude. This suspension results in the separation of religious appearances from the existential truth claims that are implicit within traditions. In other words, it brings out the separation of meaning from existence, and consequently the sidelining of what is often known as the being behind appearances. Such an approach, premised upon the transcendental subject, is unable to offer us an insight that is existentially and substantially meaningful. As a consequence, its postulation of a universal essence is often dismissed as irrelevant, especially by religious practitioners. And this dismissal is often quite serious. Therefore, there are two levels of problematic that must be taken into account if we want to continue to propose the significance of a phenomenological study of religion. The preliminary question of how phenomenology of religion can still presuppose a shared presupposition that allows us to talk about the religious, or that allows us to talk about religion, but without the bracketing of the emic truth claims that constitutes the otherness of these various religious traditions, must now be discussed in parallel with the question of how phenomenology can pursue the invisible being behind appearances, if we want to foster a more comprehensive understanding. So the plausibility of undoing the bracketing of these emic truth claims in the effort to bring about meaning and existence together, however, must engage with the presumption or the challenge or the bias that particular concerns and articulations are generally unable to contribute a more universal understanding. So particularities cannot contribute to a more fundamental or universal understanding, let alone the understanding of what it means to be human. So if you're not a phenomenologist, then you are a particularist that can only talk about insular concerns. And it is to this prejudice against emic accounts that I first turn. The hypothesis to some extent that I want to propose is only in taking the particular seriously can we, or are we able to disclose the fundamental. And so going back to the things themselves involves the particular, taking the particular seriously. Now to the prejudice against emic claims. Any attempts to propose the importance of taking the insider's account seriously in the inquiry into religion or even other inquiries will find many oppositions. This is generally because the insider's account is often equated with what is called the confessional method, which is taken to be explicitly theological in approach, biased in its claims. Indeed, this is the position that the phenomenology of religion regularly asks us to bracket because it implies a prior commitment on the part of the investigator, so which is believed to affect the neutrality and objectivity, which is very important in the description of appearances in phenomenology. So the impossibility of separating the scientific descriptions of religious manifestations from a confessional endorsement of the same in insiders' accounts and the employment of a mode of study that does not deviate from the self-understanding of the believers are often taken as examples of why according a privileged position to the insider is something that should never be done and is something that stands in the way of neutrality. In seeking to engage this and propose the importance of developing a religious way of studying religion, Arvind Sharma talks about the kinds of people belonging to a religious tradition. He places them in 4 categories. The first ones are the believers. These are the person most committed to the confessional position. Then he talks about the insiders. These are those who consider themselves insiders to a tradition in terms of their familiarity with the tradition, but they have not matured to the point of commitment within them in the confessional sense. So believers, insiders, then adherents. Sharma talks about those people who are happy to consider themselves formally adherents to a religious tradition, but without regarding themselves either as insiders or believers in it. They don't practice any of the rituals associated with the traditions. And then the last one is the participants. The participant observer who may conform to some of the practices of a religious tradition without formally even being a member of it, without having to be a member of it. The idea of a religious method is important for Sharma
because unlike the academic intellect or social scientist who surveys his materials and objects impersonally, the religious scholar seeks to understand rather than explain phenomena or describe phenomena. And therefore, he claims the religious method of studying religion is neither identical with the confessional nor with the social scientific method. While Sharma's classification of the kinds of people belonging to a tradition enables us to already appreciate the heteroglossic nature of the voices and even the levels of commitment present within any particular tradition, and it challenges the homogeneous manner in which we often talk about the emic and the ethic in the singular way in which we postulate it. It is unaware of the notion of the critical practitioners, or who I call critical insiders, whose second order reflections on their own traditions are extremely significant. Second order in the sense of not being confessional accounts, but being critical about the confessional accounts that are already present. So these second order reflections, which are resolutely critical in the interrogation of confessional truth claims of their own traditions, are unlike the insular insider accounts or the detached external accounts. The accounts of these critical practitioners are significant, not only because they are able to expose the limitations of the simplistic insider-outsider binary, but because they disclose a dialogic structure that grounds the constitution of traditions. So while the biases of the confessionalists often results in the promotion of insular accounts, in that traditions mostly talk amongst themselves and not to outsiders, and their closeness often inhibits reinvention and growth, the critical evaluation, interrogation, engagement, or to borrow McIntyre's phrase, the engagement of the epistemological crisis of our own traditions, of one's own traditions, lay the groundwork for the preservation and advancement of the tradition itself through generations. This is the medium in which the traditions are passed on through generations. So these critical insider accounts, pursued and understood in its dialogic constitution, can therefore be a source of both particular as well as fundamental insights at the same time. So if we take these critical insiders seriously, then we can see their claims about the particular, which is also fundamentally important in our understanding of what it means to be human. So given the distant or non-committed position towards existence that the phenomenological bracketing assumes, this repostulation of insider accounts is vital, because the insider acceptance of the link between meaning and being is the only medium that allows us to pursue the question of the being behind appearances, the invisible question, and the intentionally that directs every religious experience and practice particular to a tradition. This reconciling of meaning and being, as Flood points out, is possible only with the privileging of language and the sign, the shift from the philosophy of consciousness to the philosophy of the sign. This is because insider accounts are particular narratives whose knowledge arises within intersubjective networks of communication. So this turn towards language is important, not only because it is the realm within which meanings are constructed, but the acceptance of the inseparability between language and its reference allows us to inquire into the nature of the religious. Meaning is not the result of a correspondence between an autonomous concepts and objects, as is usually seen in modern Western philosophical tradition, but it is inextricably bound to the language of its expression. In the study of religion, emic claims are particularly important because, and we cannot do without emic claims, because there is always an existential claim that is implicitly embedded within the religious articulation or confession. And the denial of the relation between meaning and being, or the bracketing of this very forceful religious claim, will limit the degree to which we understand religious meanings. We can understand religious meanings, but it will limit the degree to which we can understand it. And without this dialogic insider contribution, the complexity of religion and its unique existential and fundamental forcefulness, or its imperative characteristics, cannot be meaningfully comprehended. And so with this claim serving as the framework, I now turn to Jaimini and the collection of his critical reflection upon his own tradition, called the Mīmāṃsāsūtras. So the text is called the Mīmāṃsāsūtras, and the sutras will be discussed very briefly, with the goal of explicating insights about the fundamental nature of what it means to be religiously human, or what it means to be human to some extent as well. So introducing the critical practitioner Jaimini and his Mīmāṃsāsūtras, the Purva Mīmāṃsā, which is based on the Mīmāṃsāsūtras around the 2nd century BCE, is an important scholastic tradition in Indian philosophy that carries out a reasoned investigation of the earliest portions of the Veda. It is taken to be one of the most orthodox schools amongst the Sat Darsanas, and maybe the less studied, because nobody is interested in its claims about the Vedas or rituals anymore. And so it is taken to be one of the most orthodox schools amongst the Sat Darsanas. This text is generally taken to be composed towards the close of the Vedic age. And this late Vedic period was significant in the history of Indian traditions, especially because this was a time when the complicated Vedic sacrifice, which is the epitome of a religious practice for a Vedic society, were believed to be in slow decline as a result of the growing criticism and rejection it faced from both within and outside the Hindu traditions. And this was also followed by the emergence of the development of the Darsanas, the various philosophical schools in India. So according to Francis Clooney, this was a period when the traditional Vedic orthodoxy had already lost its power to convince about, and the question of the intelligibility of sacrifices demanded attention. This is because of the increasing complications concerning its practice, and also the heightening of challenges from the Buddhists and the Jainists, as well as the world renouncers within the Vedic fold. There was also growing skeptics and materialists who were concerned about the efficacy of Vedic sacrifices and saw the practice as ultimately futile. So knowing that the plausibility of sacrificial practice and its significance for Vedic society had now to be repostulated for those who were not willing to accept it as significant and authoritative any longer, Jaimini produced the sutras as a response to this contextual dilemma. In the process of seeking to resolve complications pertaining to the interpretations as well as the enactment of enjoined sacrifices, he engaged in lengthy discussions and negotiations with interlocutors, all of whom found a voice in his text, both from within and outside the Mīmāṃsā tradition. Discussions were often followed by a reflection and a presupposition about the overall purpose of enacting sacrifices. So while the concern for the rules of what it means to practice sacrifice is very important, especially the precise enactment was an important focus, but the underlying concern of the Mīmāṃsāsūtras had to do with the why of sacrifice. Why continue the practice of a sacrifice which is no longer relevant in their society, in their world? So while the responses of the Vedic fundamentalists was simply to put aside the question of meaning and purpose and assert that sacrifices had to be performed regardless of whether you understand the meanings or not. And the response of the renunciants, the Sramanas, was to reject the practice altogether, and even the authority of the Vedas altogether. Jaimini's response was to seek justification for the validity as well as the intelligibility of sacrifice by reimagining the practice altogether. Therefore, the Mīmāṃsāsūtras is written by a critical practitioner, and is a highly sophisticated second-order reflection about the intelligibility and significance of the Vedic tradition itself. Now I turn to what I call the Vedic vertical turn. The increasing accusation of sacrifice as mere ritualism, that is, it has no purpose or meaning, which was constituted mainly to maintain the power hold of the elite Vedic Brahmanic orthodoxy, was not held by the fundamentalist response by them that the complex system of sacrifices had to be performed irrespective of individual beliefs and results. While this response is not an unusual position, in that most performers of sacrifice are themselves often unaware of the full meaning and implications of their own practice, Jaimini was concerned that the continuity of a traditionary practice, which made the transmission of a heritage and the construction of a narrative identity possible, would now be under the threat of extinction. So Jaimini had to confront two things. One, the functional understanding of sacrifice as an economy of exchange between the sacrificer and the gods. And second, he also has to engage or confront the absence of a ground upon which the foundation of Vedic sacrifice should be anchored. So it was an existential concern. Though both of these concerns could have been adequately addressed by introducing a conceptualization of the divine or the sacred or the holy or God that could serve as both the endower of sacrificial efforts, the one who gives fruits because of the practice of sacrifice, as well as serve as its fundamental ground, Jaimini chooses to talk about the intrinsic purposefulness of the sacrifice by infusing with another important Vedic concept that is more closely associated with duty, practice, and harmony, dharma. This is where the introduction of dharma comes in. Jaimini's concern is to restore the high status of communal practice, and he seeks to do this by abolishing the idols of all external reference, including, and very importantly, the gods. So Jaimini, whose positionality is not of a scholar in the sense in which we understand today, and he's not a theologian, nonetheless, he is an inquirer who is questioning the validity of the operative concepts that defined religious discourse during his time. And he helped pave the way for a critical re-interrogation of the discourse. So in a sense, the reason for pointing this out is even within emic accounts, even within emic traditions, people are already critical about their own practices. It is not the scholar who brings the problematic to them. They already understand the nature of the problematic, sometimes more than the scholar itself. So his re-envisioned notion of the religious action was one that was no longer centered on the questions about the nature of God or gods, the revelatory capacity of sacred texts known as the Vedas, or the explanation of religious manifestations through subjective experience. For him, religious action is an intentional practice whose pursuit and realization is not dependent on these external factors, but instead is one that accrues meaning to them. The place of gods, the authority of the sacred text, and the purpose and meaning of sacrifice are all realized in the event of enacting a sacrifice. Such a reinterpretation of religious action presupposes a certain kind of subjectivity, who for Jaimini is the subject who is interested in repetitive practice constituted by the mode of desire and is going to be baptized in tradition. So in a sense, Jaimini is suggesting not to us, but to his own context, that it is the centrality of practice that the study of religion must focus on, that the discourse on religion must focus on, rather than the usual general features that are attributed to the religious. So for him, at the heart of the religious is the practicing human, the human that seeks meaning and is going to be formed by tradition. And so this is where I talked about the desiring of dharma, or the desiring of the imperative. While dharma has been variously discussed as a concept, generally associated with kinship, with order, with duties, etc., across the development of the Indian tradition, the sutras of Jaimini discusses it explicitly in relation to the practice of sacrifice and the accompanying enjoyment and obligations of the Vaidika sacrificial agent. Although the majority of the Jaimini sutras is a discussion about the complicated details of enacting the sacrifices, and this is why people are generally not interested in the sutras, Jaimini he introduces his project not as a study of sacrifice, but as a dharmajijñāsā, a desire to inquire into dharma. According to Jaimini, dharma is defined as that artha or purpose which possesses the characteristics of a chodana, which possesses the characteristics of an imperative. It is dharma is that realizable purpose or meaning whose defining characteristics is a calling forth to act, an enjoyment. And Francis de Sales has pointed out this conceptualization of dharma, and he says we can understand this through the interrelationship between the invisible or the supersensible and its mode of pursuit, which presupposes a sacrificial agent or the subject. Jaimini's concern for developing the intelligibility and intrinsic purposefulness of the practice of sacrifice is therefore centered on this notion of the subject who, in the context of the crisis of meaning and imminent collapse of Vedic sacrificial foundations, nonetheless wants to affirm its practice. While the sacrifice itself is a complicated event that involves a number of factors, it is a practice that is primarily instigated or started by a certain kind of subject, one willing to conform to the patterns of Vedic tradition. Without anyone willing to conform to the patterns of Vedic tradition, there will be no sacrifices. And so Jaimini is looking for a certain kind of people who will be willing to do that. For him, this subject is distinguished by a desire to realize Dharma. At this point, Dharma is known as that purpose that is realized, but no more is said about it. In the discussion about the one who can and who ought to sacrifice, desire is mentioned as one of the fundamental markers identifying the sacrificial agent. Jaimini discusses between various kinds of Vedic practices, which he calls optional, occasional, necessary, or fixed sacrifices, as is quite common in the discussions of Vedic sacrifices. And he says, while the optional sacrifices are presented as those that are performed, as often as one desires the results proceeding from it. For example, if you want rain, if you want the birth of a son, if you want a good produce from your fields, etc., you can produce these optional sacrifices. And then he says the occasional and fixed sacrifices are taken to be performed independently of a need for something. And this is what reflects a desire which is more originary than the one that has arisen out of worldly wants and needs. So while the subject may in the first instance be concerned with the satisfaction of a need or even a personal one, this need transforms itself into a desire that welcomes and appropriates the imperative call as his or her responsibility. This dimension of desire exemplifies a kind of existential longing and pursuit, and is what best articulates the primary contours of subjectivity in the sutras. So while need, as the first instance of desire, knows precisely what it wants to accomplish, desire, on the other hand, is characterized by non-comprehension of what it wants. It is precisely because of this that the practice of fixed sacrifices are often associated with the desire for heaven. Svarva kamo yajata, the one who desires Swarga must sacrifice. The use of Swarga, which literally translated refers to heaven, is actually taken by the commentator Sabara as denoting a state of happiness or contentment that accrues upon the realization or fulfillment of the highest good. So according to Jaimini and Sabara, heaven is a concept that they have come up with, which is an outcome of an action which results is not explicitly specified. So in the same way, the desiring subject seeks in the sacrifice something that goes beyond the confines of anything that can be presented as a phenomenon. And it is precisely this unknowing that calls for responsibility or faith. This elusiveness of the purpose of sacrifice, this elusiveness of Dharma, which so far is mentioned, like we said, only as Dharma, is what ultimately constitutes the agency of the subject. So the ritual subject is not someone who is just practicing blindly in obedience, but he has an agency without which there can be no practice of sacrifice. In discussing another important constitutive features of Vedic sacrifices, Jaimini makes the claim that the Vedic injunction to perform action is addressed and entitled specifically to a subject who sees himself or herself as being able to carry out the entire details of the sacrifice. The question of the entitlement of a person to perform the sacrifice is taken together with the question of the ability of the performer to perform the sacrifice consistently until its fulfillment. The notion of fulfillment and completion of the sacrifice is vital for Jaimini because the realization of meaning or purpose of sacrifice is contingent on the coming together of all of these constitutive elements of sacrifice harmoniously. And this is what Jaimini means by Dharma. So sacrifice is the completion or the fulfillment that accrues when all of its characteristics, all of the participants, everything that is entailed in a practice comes together harmoniously. And harmoniously is quite important because the practice of sacrifice in a wrong way will not lead to Dharma, so will lead to adharma. So while desire is an important marker for the participants in a sacrifice, the sacrifice itself is non-anthropocentric in that it seeks the interdependent harmony of all the accessories of sacrifice, such as the role of the Vedas, the devatas, the mantras, the priest, the fire altar, etc. All of these are required to assure its meaning. And so this non-anthropocentric ordering, or the focus away from the subjective experience of an individual to the interrelated communicative roles of all the participants, gives rise to the development of what can be called, again following Flood, a shared subjectivity. Completion or harmonious completion is ultimately the telos of sacrifice. It is not an exchange, it is not an economy of exchange between God and the sacrificer, but it is simply completion or harmonious completion that is the telos of sacrifice. This realization is the realization of Dharma. And this realization is made possible by the self-surpassing transformation of the subject who performs in tandem with other such embodied historical selves, such as himself or herself. So Jaimini's introduction of Dharma as the telos of sacrifice, in his concern to preserve the Vedic tradition of sacrifice, is closely connected with the idea of the subject who cumulatively realizes the possibilities of his own being within this traditionary practice and pursuit. So from the outset, there is, to borrow Sloterdijk's phrase, a vertical tension or a vertical attraction or a self-surpassing tendency that is inherent in the subject's existence, which help him affirm virtues, particularly in the absence of absolute foundations. And it is through this formation of a tradition-specific subjectivity that one can reimagine sacrifice or religious action, not as a functional reciprocal relationship of gift exchange, but as a process of intensification and becoming, or a transformation undergone by human persons. The performance of religious action, therefore, while it is oriented towards the invisible, is also at once deeply anthropological. So importantly, such practices reduces the reduction of religion or the exteriorization of religion and religious practices purely in terms of law, control, blind imitation, uncritical obedience, and introduces us to the underlying existential insight that lay at the heart of religious traditions. To come towards a conclusion, the understanding of phenomenological inquiry or the understanding of critical inquiry as one that is distinguished by detachment and neutrality often leads the scholar to presume that he can stand outside a position, he can stand outside a particular position and offer empathy for insight. This positionality is clearly problematic in our quest to engage, especially with the problem of plurality, because the idea of the subject as a detached, intentional, subjective consciousness opposes or distinguishes itself from the world of other subjectivities. As Professor Emmanuel yesterday remarked, Husserl's other is another me, never the self as another. So the privileged position of neutrality it assumes is unable to relate meaningfully to the beings of other cultures, and its rational scientific method is unable to gain access to the complexities and mysteries of a tradition or the truth claims of a tradition, the inhabited religious world. That the attempt to describe the mysteries of these religious worlds by the autonomous unified subject of phenomenology often results in the adoption of terminologies such as faith, belief, enlightenment, etc., to express these religious manifestations, but which are important, but often at the cost of the more fundamental and historical understanding of religion, which is the understanding of religion as intersubjective performance, not centered around consciousness, but centered primarily around the transmission of a tradition or centered around tradition. The subjectivity in religion is not an individuated ahistorical ego that can stand outside of traditions, but it is a tradition subject who seeks to continually outperform himself or herself in pursuing a goal that is greater than any particularity. Indeed, what is passed on in religious traditions is not the subjective experiences of any particular individual, but it is instead the narrative or the chain of memories whose structures can be embodied to ensure its temporal continuity. This form of embodiment, as we have seen, is an outcome of an imperative that is desired and appropriated for one's own transformation, regardless of whether it can give us meaning or not. The response to such imperatives suggests the presence of vertical attractions that distinguishes those who catapult themselves out of their own individuated lives and from those who have never felt addressed in the same way. So there are those people who want to move out of their own individuated lives, and there are those people who never felt addressed by this imperative, by the Sloterdijk's imperative that you must change your life in the same way. So this response is what distinguishes the religious life and separates the meaning-making experience of the saints or the renouncers from that of the average person. And I think this is fair to say that We have not understood the technologies of the renouncers, especially as a scholar studying them from the outside. Sloterdijk, in his discussion of the practice of religion, although he does not want to talk about religion at all, in his discussion about the practice of what he calls religion as elite training regimens, he points out that religion is always justified by the saints, which for him, of course, are the acrobats. As he would suggest, there is no room for mediocrity in the religious world. Indeed, the part of religion that still matters to us today, and for which we have a recurring need, is its forms of practices. That is, in the sense that technologies that allows us to reshape our ways of thinking and feeling, and importantly, our ways of living. So if the fundamental nature of what it means to be human is to be subject to vertical tensions or attractions, as Sloterdijk reminds us, and which I believe is also the underlying presupposition of this conference, a part of that pursuit involves the construction of particular meaningful narratives that can ensure its commitment, or that can ensure its committed quest. This willingness to commit to one's traditionary practices is what makes the human beings, above all, a creature of habit, repetition, or a creature of artistry. The references such as the idea of the divine God, or the idea of the divine, such as God, holy, sacred, or even the Enlightenment notion of progress, or the notions of ultimate reality or emptiness and so on, that are constructed, cannot serve as the ground of religion, as they themselves built upon a more originary anthropological expression. That is the desire to outdo oneself. These may be the reasons why these references periodically entail a crisis of meaning or directionality, as we have seen in the Vedic world, and have to be reinvented at different points in history. Very slowly, but have to be reinvented at different points in history. The telos or narratives may define the religious for each particular context, but they do not fundamentally constitute it. The representations of these contextual and diverse points of references as the essential features of religion prevents us from interrogating the fundamental constitutions that gives rise to these institutions. So if you want to talk about going back to the things themselves, then we have to talk about the human longing to outdo oneself, to be better, to go higher in every sense. So anthropotechnics in the sense of Sloterdijk. To finally conclude, religion, however conceived or understood, we can say is a phenomenon that is thoroughly infused with some existential meaning. And to have a window to access this forcefulness of its imperative requires more than a detached or even empathetic observation. It requires the responsibility of understanding the dialogic constitution of traditions, as well as the intersubjective relation between humans that is continually negotiated through language. Unlike Husserl and maybe even Kant and Descartes before him, who took it for granted that the self-evident knower is both temporally and logically prior to the world known by the cogito, we are intersubjective prior to the cogito. We are beings thrown in the world prior to the cogito. And the other, including us as the observer, is also integrally bound up in the dialogic process of understanding. So to finally conclude, there is no privileged scholar and practitioner as well who possesses the meaning of the religious in an exclusive sense. The religious is not a pre-given object that need only be discovered and described. It is not for the scholar, and it is neither for the practitioner, as the practice of the Vedic of sacrifice has seen. So not unlike the practice of Vedic sacrifice, the responsibility of understanding religion is a harmonious and collective realization that happens afterwards, not prior. Thank you.